She was 7 months pregnant when she discovered her husband had been stealing $50,000 from her every single month for 8 years. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part? His first wife killed herself after he drained her fortune. His second wife simply vanished. And now Sarah was carrying his child. What would you do if you found out the man sleeping next to you was a predator who hunted wealthy women, and you were his third target? But here's what Sarah didn't know yet. The fortune her husband was stealing, it wasn't thousands, it wasn't millions, it was $2.7 trillion. An inheritance her own father had hidden from her since childhood. A family that had been searching for her for over 20 years. One push in a bank lobby, one stranger who recognized her mother's face, one discovery that would turn a terrified pregnant woman into one of the most powerful women in America. This is the story of how Sarah Mitchell found her family, exposed a monster, and built a legacy that would change millions of lives. Before we begin, I want you to know something important. This story isn't just entertainment. It's a blueprint for recognizing financial abuse, understanding your worth, and finding the courage to break free from toxic relationships. If you've ever felt trapped, controlled, or made to believe you are powerless, this story is for you. Have you ever felt completely dismissed, like you were invisible? That's how Sarah Mitchell felt as the click of her heels echoed in the cavernous lobby of Metropolitan Trust Bank. With one hand resting on her baby bump, now 6 months along, she clutched her purse and headed for the platinum banking area. It was a world of polished mahogany and brass designed to make you feel small if you did not belong. A security guard stopped her short. "Excuse me, ma'am, but this section is for our premium clients," he said, his tone polite but firm. A hot flush of embarrassment crept up Sarah's neck. "I'm here about my husband's business accounts, Richard Mitchell of TechFlow Dynamics." The guard's entire demeanor changed in an instant. "Oh, Mr. Mitchell, of course. Please, come right this way." As she followed the guard, Sarah's heart pounded. Her perfect life had crumbled just 3 weeks ago. That was when she found out that Richard, her husband of 8 years, had been hiding a fortune from her. He claimed they were barely making ends meet and could not even afford a nice crib for their baby. But he was secretly managing several business accounts she had never known existed. She had discovered it completely by accident. Needing his password to buy groceries after her phone died, she had used his laptop and saw the emails. Bank statements with transfers so large they made her dizzy. For years, her husband, who insisted they lived paycheck to paycheck on his 6-figure income, had been feeding her a complete lie. "Ms. Mitchell," the guard said, pausing his stride, "the manager's office is right through there. Are you certain you do not want to wait for your husband?" But before Sarah could form a reply, the heavy front doors flew open with a bang. Richard Mitchell stormed into the bank with enough force to make everyone stop and stare. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, but his jaw was clenched in a way that Sarah knew meant trouble. His voice cut across the vast marble floor, sharp as a razor. "Sarah, what in the hell do you think you are doing here?" Suddenly, every single person in the bank was looking at them. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with shame, but another feeling was rising too, a hot surge of anger. "I am trying to figure out why you have 3 secret business accounts while telling me we cannot afford to furnish our baby's room." He closed the distance between them in 3 long, intimidating steps. At 6'2", Richard had a way of using his height to make others feel small, and he was using it now. "You have no business digging into my private financial matters." "Your private financial matters?" Sarah's voice trembled but grew louder. "We are married, Richard. We are supposed to be a team." "Keep your voice down," Richard hissed. his eyes darting around at their captive audience. "You are making a fool of yourself." "I am making a fool of myself?" The words erupted from her, louder than she had intended. "You are the one who has been lying about our money for years, and you think I am the one who should be embarrassed?" "Do not tell me what to do." Richard's voice was like the crack of a whip in the silent lobby. "Richard, please, not here. Can we just—" "I said, do not tell me what to do." It happened in a flash. Richard's hand shot out and shoved her shoulder. The push was harder than necessary, and her pregnant body, already unsteady, reeled backward. She gasped, grabbing onto a marble pillar to keep from falling, her heart hammering against her ribs from the shock of it all. Her husband had just put his hands on her, in public, while she was carrying his child. "Is there a problem here?" The voice that sliced through the thick tension was quiet, yet it carried an authority that made the entire bank go still. Sarah looked up and saw a man stepping out from the executive offices. He was tall with silver hair, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like it cost more than her car. James Wellington had managed the Platinum Division of Metropolitan Trust for 15 years, and he had never witnessed a scene quite like this one. When his eyes locked with Sarah's, something shifted in his gaze. It looked like recognition, or maybe confusion. She seemed familiar to him, stirring a feeling deep in his chest that he could not immediately place. "No problem at all," Richard said, his tone instantly shifting to the smooth, charming one he reserved for business associates. "Just a little domestic disagreement." "A disagreement?" Sarah stared at her husband, completely stunned. "You pushed me." "I barely touched you," Richard snapped back. "Stop being so dramatic." James Wellington moved closer, his sharp eyes assessing the entire situation. The pregnant woman clinging to the pillar for support, the angry, red-faced husband, and the crowd of onlookers trying not to be obvious. After 15 years in his line of work, he had a finely tuned instinct for people, and every part of him screamed that this was a serious problem. "Why don't we continue this discussion in my office?" James said. His tone was a calm suggestion, but the look in his eyes made it an order. "All of us?" Richard's confident mask began to crack. He clearly had not counted on the bank manager intervening. "That is not necessary. We are leaving now." "Actually," Sarah said, her voice finding a new strength, "I came here for a reason. I need to speak with you about my husband's accounts." "Sarah?" Richard warned, his voice a low, menacing growl. "No, Richard. I am finished pretending that everything is okay." James observed the exchange with a mixture of professional concern and personal curiosity. This woman, Sarah, possessed a quiet strength that was truly impressive, especially given her condition, and there was just something about her face he could not get out of his head. "Mrs. Mitchell," James said gently, "please, let's step into my office. I am confident we can get this sorted out." As he led the way, James kept stealing glances at Sarah's profile. The curve of her nose, the set of her jaw, her posture, it all sparked a distant memory he could not quite bring into focus. 3 hours later, Sarah was sitting in her car, parked in front of the bank. Her hands were trembling as she thought back on her conversation with the manager. James Wellington had been professional and surprisingly kind. While he could not legally share specific account details, he did confirm that Richard had multiple business accounts with very large balances. But that was not the reason for her shaking. The real shock came when he saw her maiden name on the paperwork. His face had gone completely white as he asked, his voice barely a whisper, "Was your mother's name Elizabeth Wellington?" How on earth could he have known her mother's name? What do you do when you find out the life you built is based on a lie? When you realize the person sleeping next to you is a total stranger? This question had been haunting Sarah for weeks, ever since she uncovered Richard's betrayal. As she turned the key in the ignition, Sarah knew what she had to do. She was going to learn everything she could about James Wellington and figure out why the mention of her mother made him look like he had just seen a ghost. This awful, confusing, life-altering day was far from over. In fact, she had a feeling it was only the beginning. As Sarah drove, a heavy rain began to fall, the drops streaking down her windshield like the tears she refused to shed. Her phone buzzed, and her sister Emma's name flashed on the car's display. "Hey, Em?" Sarah tried her best to sound normal. "Sarah, you sound terrible. What is wrong?" Emma could always tell when something was bothering her big sister, even over the phone. "Richard pushed me at the bank today, in front of a crowd of people." The line went silent for a few long seconds. When Emma finally spoke, her voice was cold with fury. "He did what?" "Sarah, that is assault. Especially now. You have to call the police." "I did not call them." Sarah pulled into her driveway, noticing with relief that Richard was not home yet. But something else happened. Something really weird. What kind of weird? Sarah cut the engine, letting the silence of the dark garage surround her. The manager of the bank, James Wellington, when he saw Mom's maiden name on a form, he looked like he was going to faint. I think he knew her. "That is not possible," Emma said instantly. "You remember what Dad told us after Mom died? He said her family cut her off completely. They hated him for marrying her and taking her away from all their money." Sarah had heard the story 1,000 times. Their father, David Mitchell, was just a regular insurance salesman who met Elizabeth Wellington at a gala in Boston and fell in love. He always said her wealthy family disowned her for marrying beneath her and that they wanted nothing to do with her daughters after she died of cancer when Sarah was 12 and Emma was only 9. "But what if Dad was not telling us the whole story?" Sarah whispered. "What if there is more to it?" At that very moment, 15 miles away, in a corner office overlooking the city, James Wellington was doing the same. A single phone call was about to change everything for James Wellington. He dialed a familiar number. "Marcus, it's James. I need a full background check on someone." He paused. "And yes, it needs to happen right away." For more than 10 years, Marcus Rodriguez had served as James's private investigator, taking care of everything from corporate investigations to security for the bank's most important clients. "What's the name, Va?" Marcus asked from the other end. "Richard Mitchell, the CEO of TechFlow Dynamics, but I am actually more focused on his wife, Sarah. Her maiden name was Sarah Catherine Wellington." "Wellington? Is she any relation to you?" James's eyes drifted to a photograph on his desk. It was a faded picture from his sister Elizabeth's wedding 25 years ago. Elizabeth looked beautiful in her simple, white gown, holding the hand of a man James had never liked. David Mitchell had seemed pleasant on the surface, but James always felt something was off about him. Maybe it was how quickly he had charmed Elizabeth, or how he seemed so eager to move her away from her family in Boston. "It's possible," James answered quietly. "Get me everything you can. I want her family history, financial statements, even medical records, if you can get them legally. I have to know if this woman is who I think she is." After ending the call, James opened a drawer in his desk and took out a small wooden box he had not touched for many years. Inside, carefully wrapped in tissue, was a delicate gold locket engraved with the Wellington family crest. He had purchased it years ago for Elizabeth's daughter, a niece he was afraid he would never have the chance to meet. Meanwhile, back in her own kitchen, Sarah was having a very similar discussion with her sister Emma. Emma had rushed over the moment she heard about the confrontation at the bank. "You never mention Mom's family," Emma said, placing 2 mugs of tea on the table. "Maybe it's finally time to look into them." "You know exactly why I don't," Sarah responded. "After Mom passed away when we were little, Dad told us her family wanted nothing to do with us. He claimed they held him responsible for taking her away from all their money. But what if that was a lie? The question lingered between them. Emma had always been the skeptical one, the sister who challenged authority and searched for answers when a story did not make sense. Sarah was the peacemaker, always accepting things as they were and trying to maintain harmony. Why would Dad lie about something that huge? Sarah wondered aloud. Maybe he was just ashamed. Emma proposed a theory. Think about it, Sarah. Mom was from a wealthy family, right? I mean, seriously wealthy. What if they offered to help after she died? But Dad's pride wouldn't let him take it. What if he was the one who told them to stay away because he couldn't stand being seen as a charity case? Sarah thought about it. Their father had always been a proud man, sometimes to his own detriment. He had worked 2 different jobs just to keep them in a good neighborhood after their mother's death, turning down help from everyone. She had always seen it as a sign of his independence, but now she wondered if there was a darker side to his pride. There's only one way to know for sure, Emma stated. You have to go back to that bank and speak with James Wellington. If he knew Mom, he might have the answers you need. That evening, just as Sarah was settling in for a quiet night by herself, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Mrs. Mitchell? My name is James Wellington from Metropolitan Trust Bank. I think it is important that we speak. Sarah's heart started to pound in her chest. Is this about my husband's accounts? I am not sure there is anything left to say. This is not about your husband's accounts, James said in a careful tone. It is about yours. Mine? But I do not have any accounts with your bank. Mrs. Mitchell, would you be free to meet tomorrow morning? We have some family matters that need to be discussed, matters that concern your mother. Sarah gripped her phone even tighter. My mother has been gone for over 20 years. What could you possibly know about my family? Your mother's name was Elizabeth Wellington, correct? The question felt like a punch to the gut. How did you know that? Who are you? I am someone who has been searching for you for a very, very long time. Please, Mrs. Mitchell, James said gently. Just give me 1 hour of your time tomorrow morning. I am certain you will want to hear what I have to tell you. After she hung up the phone, Sarah sat alone in her quiet house. Richard still had not come home from wherever he went after the scene at the bank. For the first time, in a long time, she let her thoughts drift to her mother. Elizabeth Wellington. Mitchell had been a beautiful, kind, and incredibly intelligent woman. She was fluent in 3 languages, could play the piano like a professional, and had a gift for making everyone feel important. But she was always guarded about her past. Sarah could recall asking about her grandparents, aunts, and uncles, but the answers were always vague. My family is complicated, my dear, Elizabeth used to say. Sometimes it is better to build the family you choose, rather than focus on the family you were born into. Now, sitting in the dark, Sarah wondered if her mother was trying to shield her daughters from a person or a situation. As if on cue, Richard's car lights swept across the window as he pulled into the driveway. Sarah heard his heavy steps on the porch, the sound of the key turning in the lock, and she braced herself for the fight that was sure to come. We need to talk, Richard announced the moment he stepped inside. Yes, Sarah replied calmly. We certainly do. Richard's voice boomed through the house as he walked toward the kitchen where Sarah was waiting. His footsteps were heavy and deliberate, filled with anger. She knew this conversation would not end well. You made me look like a fool today, Richard said, as he entered the room, yanking his tie loose. Do you have any clue what you did to my reputation? Your reputation? Sarah's voice remained steady. You shoved your pregnant wife in front of everyone, and you are the one worried about your reputation? I hardly laid a hand on you. You are being overly dramatic, as always. Richard went to the refrigerator, grabbed a beer, and opened it with unnecessary force. But this is not about that. This is about you sneaking behind my back and trying to get into my business accounts. They are our accounts, Richard. We are married. No, Sarah. They are my accounts, for my business. You have no legal claim to them, and you definitely do not have the right to humiliate me in front of my own banker. Sarah watched him take a long drink of his beer. She noticed the way his jaw tightened when he was angry and how his eyes never fully met hers whenever he was telling a lie. After 8 years of marriage, she knew how to read these signs, but she had spent most of those years finding ways to excuse them. Richard, I saw the bank statements on your laptop. I know all about the accounts. I know we are not having the financial problems you have been telling me about. Richard slammed his beer bottle down on the counter, making Sarah flinch. You were going through my private computer? My phone died while I was trying to order groceries. I needed the password for the app, and I saw your email was already open. The bank statements were just sitting there. So you thought you would just start snooping? I decided I wanted to understand why my husband has been lying to me about our finances while I have been cutting out coupons and buying baby clothes from secondhand stores. A heavy silence filled the space between them, thick with 8 years of hidden anger and lies. Sarah had always known Richard was controlling with money, but she had always justified it as part of his business sense. Successful men were smart with their money, she had told herself. They always planned for the future. They managed their resources carefully. But now she was starting to see that what she had seen as financial prudence was actually a form of financial abuse. You do not understand how business works, Sarah, Richard finally said. Those accounts are for complicated deals, managing cash flow, things that are far too complex for you to grasp. Try me. What? Try me, she repeated. Explain it to me. I have a degree in mathematics, Richard. I am pretty sure I can keep up with where our money is going. The look on Richard's face changed. For a brief second, Sarah saw a flash of something in his eyes that made a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. You need to let this go, Sarah. You need to say you are sorry for what happened today, and you need to promise me that you will never set foot in that bank again. Or what? Or you will face the consequences. The menace in his words filled the air between them like a toxic fume. Sarah felt the baby kick, almost as if it was reacting to her racing heart, and she put a protective hand over her stomach. Are you threatening me, Richard? I am protecting this family. Somebody has to. Before Sarah could say anything else, her phone rang. The screen showed the same unknown number from earlier that night. Do not answer that, Richard ordered, but Sarah had already answered the call. Hello? Mrs. Mitchell, it's James Wellington again. I apologize for calling you so late, but I have been looking into a few things since we spoke, and I now believe this situation is much more urgent than I originally thought. What kind of situation? Sarah asked. She was fully aware of Richard standing only a few feet from her, his whole body rigid with fury. I would really rather not get into it over the phone. Could we possibly meet first thing in the morning, say at 8 o'clock? I do not think that is a good idea, Sarah said, glancing at Richard's face, which was now a frightening shade of red. Ms. Mitchell, I can understand why you might be hesitant, but I have some information about your mother's family that I truly believe you need to hear. It is information regarding your inheritance. My what? Your inheritance, Mrs. Mitchell. I have reason to believe that you are entitled to a very large family estate that you have never been told about. Suddenly, Sarah's knees felt weak. She slowly sat down in a kitchen chair, her other hand still resting on her belly. That is impossible. My mother's family cut her off completely when she married my father. Mrs. Mitchell, with all due respect, I think you have been told some very inaccurate information about your family's history. Your mother was my sister, and for more than 20 years we have been searching for you. The phone tumbled from Sarah's grasp, landing with a clatter on the kitchen table. Richard reacted instantly, snatching the device before Sarah had a chance to pick it back up. "This is Richard Mitchell," he stated into the phone, his tone cold and businesslike. "My wife is pregnant and overly emotional, so she is not in a condition to make sound judgments right now. I would appreciate it if you stopped bothering her with whatever con you are trying to pull." "Mr. Mitchell," James's voice was perfectly clear, even from several feet away. "I can promise you, this is no con. I am a licensed banker and a member of the Wellington family. Your wife is my niece. That is not possible," Richard said, but Sarah could hear the doubt starting to form in his voice. "Mr. Mitchell, I possess legal documents, family pictures, and official proof of our relationship. I also have some worries about your wife's financial state that we should probably talk about." Richard hung up and spun around to look at Sarah, who was just staring at him with a look that was half shock and half dawning realization. "He is lying," Richard insisted. "It is clearly some kind of scam, likely from someone who heard about my business doing well and figured they could trick us out of some money." But memories were flooding back to Sarah. The distant look her mother would get whenever she spoke of Boston, the valuable jewelry that had vanished after her mother passed away, pieces her father claimed had simply been lost, the way her mother knew so much about art, music, and high culture that never quite matched the simple, middle-class life they lived. "What if he is not lying?" Sarah asked in a soft voice. "Just think about it. If your mother truly came from a wealthy family, do you not think we would have known about it? Do you not think they would have reached out after she passed away?" "Maybe they did try," Sarah replied, as the different pieces of the puzzle started to click into place. "Maybe Dad just never told us. Your father would never have hidden something that important from you." "Are you so sure?" Sarah got to her feet, standing to face her husband from across the kitchen. "Just like you would never hide financial details from me?" Richard's face turned red with anger. "That is a completely different situation, is it? You have been lying to me about our money for years, Richard. You let me believe that we were barely getting by while you were stashing thousands of dollars in bank accounts I never even knew existed. Why should I believe you know what my father would or would not hide from me?" "Because I am your husband," Richard yelled back. "Because I am the father of your child. Because every single thing I do is for the protection of our family. By keeping secrets from me, by handling things that you think I do not need to worry about." Sarah gazed at her husband, truly seeing him for the first time in their 8 years of marriage. She saw the control, the manipulation, and the way he always made her feel foolish and insignificant any time she dared to question him. This was her reality. This was the life she had come to accept as normal. "I am calling him back," she declared. "No, you are not. Yes, I am, and I plan to meet with him tomorrow morning. Sarah, if you make that phone call, if you attend that meeting, you will regret it." "I am serious." Sarah raised her phone and looked directly at her husband. "Richard, I do not think you get it. I'm not afraid of your threats anymore." As she scrolled through her call history to find James Wellington's number, Sarah understood that, for the first time in years, her husband's anger did not scare her. Her curiosity about the truth was far stronger than any fear, and that single thought was more freeing than anything she had experienced in a very long time. The following morning, Sarah was seated opposite James Wellington in his office paneled in rich mahogany, her hands clutching a coffee cup that had gone cold in her hands. Bright morning sunlight poured through the tall windows, bathing the room in a golden light that made the entire scene feel unreal. "You are the spitting image of her," James said, quietly, his eyes fixed on Sarah's face as if he were trying to commit every detail to memory. "Of who?" "Of your mother, Elizabeth, my sister." The coffee cup clinked against its saucer as Sarah set it down. Your sister? That cannot be right. My mother's family wanted nothing to do with her after she married my father. James Wellington was a man in his early 60s, with a distinguished look, silver hair, and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He was not smiling at the moment. His face showed a deep sadness, mixed with what looked like regret. Is that what your father told you? James asked in a soft tone. Sarah, we spent years looking for Elizabeth after she vanished. We brought in private investigators, posted rewards, and called every Elizabeth Mitchell in the entire country. We eventually had to assume she had passed away. She did pass away, from cancer. When I was 12, I am aware. We discovered it 3 years too late. James slid open a desk drawer and took out a thick manila folder filled with papers. We were finally able to locate the death certificate in 2010. By that time, both you and your sister had already left your father's home. We had no way of tracking you down. Sarah felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. Everything she had been taught about her mother's family, every reason she had believed for their modest lifestyle, could have been a complete fabrication. But why would my dad tell us you cut her off? She asked. To be honest, I am not sure, James replied. Elizabeth left Boston very unexpectedly, right after she married your father. She stopped answering phone calls and did not reply to any letters. Our best guess was that David persuaded her to cut us out of her life. Perhaps he felt that you did not approve of him. We did not at first, James confessed. David came across as a decent fellow, but Elizabeth was in line to inherit a very large part of the Wellington family fortune. We were worried that his motives for marrying her might have been financial. And were you correct? James paused for a long moment. I cannot say for sure. What I can say is that Elizabeth was due to receive a trust fund valued at around $250 million at the time of her death. That inheritance was supposed to pass directly to her children. Sarah let out a laugh that had no joy in it. I am sorry, did you just say $250 million? That was its value in 2003. After compound interest and the growth of investments, your inheritance today is valued at approximately $2.7 trillion. Trillion? The word came out of Sarah's mouth as a faint whisper. That cannot be real. For 4 generations, the Wellington family has been building wealth through shipping, real estate, and technology, James explained with patience. We were among the first to invest in several companies that grew to be huge successes. Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon. Your great-grandfather had a knack for spotting breakthrough technologies. Sarah shot up from her chair and walked over to the window that offered a view of the city skyline. This had to be some sort of mistake, or maybe an incredibly elaborate prank. Women like her worried about grocery coupons and whether they had enough money for new baby furniture. They did not inherit trillions of dollars. I need some proof, she said, her back still to him. I need to see the documents, of course. James opened a second folder and laid out a series of papers on his desk. He had birth certificates, a detailed family tree, even an offer for genetic testing, if you want it, and photographs going all the way back to your mother's childhood. Sarah returned to the desk and began to examine the papers. There it was. Her mother's birth certificate, Elizabeth Catherine Wellington, born in Boston, Massachusetts. A family tree traced the Wellington line back to the 1800s, and pictures, scores of them, of a young woman who was her exact double. At family parties, charity functions, and elegant dinners, it is really her, Sarah whispered, holding a photograph of Elizabeth at what looked like a college graduation ceremony. She seemed so happy. She was brilliant, James said with obvious pride. She graduated with highest honors from Harvard, with degrees in both mathematics and computer science. She actually created algorithms we still rely on for our investment strategies to this day. Mom was a computer science major? Sarah glanced up. astonished. I had no idea. She never said a word about it. It seems there is a great deal your father chose not to tell you about your mother's life before she married him. Sarah collapsed back into her chair, crushed by the weight of everything she was learning. Her mother was not just a housewife who passed away too soon. She had been a genius mathematician and computer scientist who came from one of the wealthiest families in America. James, she began, speaking slowly, if all of this is real, if I truly am set to receive this inheritance, there is something I have to tell you about my husband. What is it? Yesterday, when I went to the bank to inquire about his accounts, he actually shoved me right there, in front of everybody. And last night, after you called, he threatened me. A shadow passed over James's face. What sort of threats did he make? He told me there would be consequences if I decided to meet with you today. Sarah, I have something else I must tell you. Following our talk yesterday, I asked my investigators to do a background check on your husband. Richard Mitchell has been methodically taking money from a monthly allowance connected to your trust fund. What are you talking about? When you and Richard got married, he was granted access to a spousal allowance from your inheritance. For 8 straight years, $50,000 had been stolen from her every single month. A wave of nausea washed over Sarah. $50,000. Your husband was secretly pocketing almost $5 million of your family's money, all while claiming you were too broke to buy furniture for your baby. Sarah felt the world tilt on its axis as the true scale of Richard's betrayal hit her. This was more than him just hiding his business profits. He had concealed her entire inheritance, though, money that was legally hers, money that could have given them a completely different life. She stared into space and whispered, he said we were barely making ends meet. Sarah, her Uncle James said gravely, your husband is a predator who uses money as his weapon, and I do not think he is doing this alone. What are you saying? James paused, his hand hovering over another file before he opened it. Our research shows that Richard has a history of this. This is the 3rd time. He seeks out women from rich families, marries them, and then seizes control of their finances. And after that, he cuts them off from their family. Other wives? The question was barely a whisper as Sarah's hand moved to shield her pregnant stomach. What did he do to them? His first wife, a woman named Margaret Thornton, took her own life after he emptied her entire trust fund. The second, Patricia Carlyle, vanished without a trace. Her family is convinced he killed her, but they never recovered a body. The air in the room felt thick and unbreathable. The man she loved, the man whose baby she was carrying, might actually be a murderer. Sarah, James said softly, I believe you are in far greater peril than we first thought, especially since you now know about your inheritance. The baby, Sarah breathed out. He has been insisting that the baby take his last name. He wants to be named the primary parent on all the official birth records. If you were to have a fatal accident during labor or shortly after, and Richard was the child's sole legal guardian, he would gain control of your whole inheritance by acting as the baby's legal guardian. The realization struck Sarah with the force of a punch to the gut. Richard's plan was not just about draining her current trust. He was setting himself up to take everything in the event of her death. And considering the fate of his other wives, her death would likely be no accident. I have to leave, Sarah declared, pushing herself to her feet. I have to get away from him now. Hold on, James insisted. You cannot just run. If you vanish, Richard will immediately suspect you know the truth. We have to be smart about this. Our first priority is keeping you and your baby safe. So, what is the plan? The first step is moving your inheritance into new accounts that he cannot touch. After that, we will collect all the proof of Richard's crimes. And then, We will ensure he can never harm another person again." As Sarah gazed at her uncle, a feeling she had not known for years began to surface. Hope. Finally, after uncovering the web of lies, she understood she was no longer on her own. "Where do we begin?" she asked, her voice stronger now. A warm smile spread across James's face, and in it, Sarah saw a comforting reflection of her own mother. "We begin by moving you to a secure location, and after that, it will be time for you to meet the rest of your family." When Sarah arrived home later that day, Richard was already there. He sat in the living room, a pile of legal papers fanned out on the coffee table. He was wearing his power suit, the expensive one, reserved for high-stakes business meetings. His face was a carefully constructed mask of calm that always set Sarah on edge. "Hello, darling," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the documents. "We need to talk." Sarah placed her keys and purse on the console, immediately noticing that Richard had strategically blocked her path. He was positioned directly between her and the only way out. It was a quiet move meant to intimidate her, a tactic she now saw with perfect clarity. "What is all this?" she asked, nodding toward the stack of papers. "Just some documents to make our lives easier," Richard answered, his gaze finally lifting to meet hers. His smile was cold and empty. "There is a financial power of attorney, a revised will, and of course, the custody agreement for our child." A chill shot down Sarah's spine. James had warned her about these exact papers. "Richard, we have not talked about any of this. The baby will not be here for another 3 months." "Well, we are discussing them now." Richard rose to his feet and advanced on her, careful to keep himself between Sarah and the door. "Since you have proven yourself incapable of managing our money, judging by that little outburst at the bank yesterday, I will be taking full control from now on." "I will not sign a single thing," Sarah stated, retreating toward the kitchen. For a moment, Richard's composed demeanor cracked. "Oh, yes, you will." "No, Richard, I will not." "Sarah, it seems you are forgetting a few key details here." He pursued her into the kitchen, his voice dripping with that condescending tone she despised. "You are 7 months pregnant, you are unemployed, with no personal income, and you have absolutely no family to run to. You are completely dependent on me." The lies were so polished, so practiced, that for a split second, she almost fell for them again. Just a few hours earlier, she would have caved, but not anymore. "Actually, Richard, you are wrong. I have a family, and they have more resources than you could possibly dream of." It was the first time she had ever seen Richard's smug confidence waver. "What on earth are you talking about?" "I am talking about the Wellingtons. Does that name ring a bell?" Richard went so pale that for a second Sarah thought he might collapse. "That cannot be right. You said your mother's family cut her off completely." "I was mistaken. And you were mistaken when you assumed you could get away with robbing them." Richard's carefully crafted composure shattered, exposing the furious, cornered man he truly was. "You have no idea what you are saying." "Oh, but I do. I know all about the $50,000 a month you funneled out of my trust fund. I know about Margaret Thornton. I know about Patricia Carlyle. I know everything about your sick game of marrying rich women just to ruin them." The blood rushed back into Richard's face, turning it a deep shade of crimson. "Who has been talking to you?" "My Uncle James told me everything. You remember him, the bank manager you tried to bully yesterday." "Your uncle?" Richard's voice was thin and strained. "Sarah, whatever they have been telling you is a complete lie. They are just trying to poison you against me. The same way you poisoned me against my own family with your lies for the last 8 years?" Richard snatched the legal papers from the table and marched to the front door. "This is far from over, Sarah. You do not know who you are messing with." "No, It is over, and I know exactly who I am dealing with. I am dealing with a con man who married me for a fortune he never knew I had. With his hand on the doorknob, Richard stopped and turned. You feel pretty clever right now, do you not? Thinking your wealthy family will just ride in and rescue you? I think that for the first time in my adult life, I am seeing everything with perfect clarity. Then allow me to offer you a little clarity, darling. His voice lowered to a menacing whisper that sent shivers down her spine. You are pregnant with my baby, and that gives me rights. Legal rights that you cannot ignore. If you believe this newfound family, money means you can simply walk away, you are in for a rude awakening. Leave now, Richard! This is my house as well. Get out of here before I phone the police. Richard locked eyes with her, and what Sarah saw there made her blood run cold. It was the expression of a desperate animal trapped in a corner, with nothing left to lose. You will live to regret this day, Sarah. I swear it. The moment the door slammed shut, Sarah's hands trembled as she dialed James's number. He knows, she choked out the second he picked up. He knows that I spoke with you. He knows about the money. James, I am scared. I think he is truly dangerous. Tell me your location. I am at the house, but I cannot stay here. I agree. Put together a small bag with enough for a couple of days. A car is on its way to you now. Where am I going? You are going to the family estate. It is past time for you to meet the Wellington family. About 20 minutes later, while Sarah was throwing essentials into a suitcase, she heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Her heart sank. It was not the town car James had described. It was Richard's expensive sports car, and he had company. Peeking through the curtains, Sarah saw two imposing men get out of the car. They were large, dressed in sharp suits, and looked like hired muscle. Her phone buzzed. The caller ID showed it was James. Sarah, my driver should be pulling up any second now. Richard is back, Sarah whispered into the phone, backing away from the window. And he brought two big guys with him. I think he is going to make me sign those documents. Go into the bathroom immediately and lock the door. Do not open it for any reason until you hear police sirens. You already called for help? The moment you told me he made threats, I called them. They will be there any minute. Just then, Sarah heard the front door creak open, followed by the sound of several heavy sets of feet on the hardwood floor. Richard's voice boomed her name. She clutched her half-packed suitcase and scrambled for the ensuite bathroom, twisting the lock just as the footsteps started up the staircase. Sarah! Richard's voice reverberated from the hallway. Let us not make this any more difficult than it already is. All I want is a little chat. Crouched on the cold tile floor, Sarah wrapped one arm around her belly, shielding her unborn child. She marveled at how her entire world had been turned upside down in less than a day. Only yesterday, she believed she was an isolated, pregnant wife, married to a domineering but loving husband. Now, she was a wealthy heiress on the run from a man who was very likely trying to murder her. In the distance, a faint wail began. It grew steadily louder, cutting through the tense silence, promising that this nightmare was about to end, one way or another. Sarah hid in the bathroom, listening to the angry shouts from downstairs, which were followed by the sharp slam of the front door. By the time the police had broken down the bathroom door to check on her safety, Richard and his friends were long gone. However, they had left something behind that made her feel a deep, cold dread. On her bed, right beside her open suitcase, lay the legal papers Richard had been pressuring her to sign. Now they were filled out with her signature expertly forged. Detective Rodriguez said softly, Mrs. Mitchell, we've uncovered evidence of financial fraud, identity theft, and a history of domestic abuse that goes back through 3 marriages. Your uncle gave us a substantial amount of documentation." Sarah asked, "What's going to happen now?" He replied, "Now we're going to ensure your husband never has the opportunity to harm you or anyone else again." As the police cruisers pulled away, their evidence bags filled with forged papers and Richard's financial statements, Sarah understood that she was truly free at last. She was free from the lies, free from the manipulation, and free from the constant fear. More importantly, she was now free to find out who she really was, after so many years of being told she was helpless. That journey of self-discovery was only just beginning. The Wellington family property spanned 200 acres of gorgeous Hudson Valley scenery. The Georgian mansion at its center seemed to rise out of the manicured grounds like a scene from a fairy tale. As their car followed the winding driveway, Sarah pressed her cheek against the window, finding it hard to believe this incredible place was part of her family's history. "This was your mother's home," James said quietly from the seat next to her. She would ride her horses in those fields every morning before heading to school. In the distance, Sarah saw horses grazing, their coats shining in the afternoon sun. "She never told me she liked horses. She never told me about any of this," James continued. "Elizabeth had a natural gift with animals. She won multiple equestrian events while she was in college." He gestured toward a smaller structure, visible among the trees. "That's the stable where she kept her horse. Midnight. After she moved away, we let him retire in the pasture. He lived to be 32 years old. We buried him right there, under that big oak tree." The car slowed to a halt before the mansion's main entrance, where a man and a woman stood waiting on the porch. Sarah knew them from the family pictures James had shared with her. They were her cousins, David and Margaret. David Wellington walked toward her as she stepped out of the car, his friendly smile making her feel comfortable right away. He was in his early 40s, with light brown hair and smile lines creasing the corners of his eyes. He looked like he could be a movie star if he wasn't in charge of Wellington Holdings' West Coast division. David said, "Elizabeth always talked about having daughters one day," as he gave Sarah a gentle hug, careful of her pregnant stomach. "She would have been so incredibly proud of you." Margaret Wellington was a bit more formal, but just as kind. She was a tall, elegant woman with a striking silver streak in her dark hair, carrying herself with an authority that would command attention in any boardroom across the globe. "We've had your mother's old room prepared for you," Margaret said, her voice clear and kind. "I do hope you'll find it comfortable while we handle this mess with your husband." As they entered the mansion's grand foyer, Sarah was struck by the sheer opulence that surrounded her. Crystal chandeliers dangled from intricately painted ceilings, priceless works of art decorated the walls, and Persian carpets lay over floors that shone with a perfect polish. "It is a lot to take in," James commented, noticing the look on her face. "Your mother felt the same way when she first returned home from college. She often said the house felt like a museum. That was, until she filled it with her laughter." They ascended a magnificent, curving staircase to the second story, where James pushed open the door to a sun-drenched bedroom suite that literally made Sarah gasp. The room was adorned in gentle blues and yellows, and a pair of French doors opened onto a private balcony that offered a view of the gardens. "This was Elizabeth's room from the time she was 12 until she went off to college," Margaret explained. "We've kept it precisely as she left it." Sarah moved slowly through the space, observing the small details that told her so much about the mother she never had the chance to know. One wall was lined with bookshelves, overflowing with books on mathematics, computer science, literature, and art. A baby grand piano stood in a corner by the windows, with a Chopin nocturne still open on the music stand. "She was a beautiful pianist," David said, noticing where Sarah was looking. She would play for the whole family every Christmas Eve. On the dressing table was a collection of family pictures Sarah hadn't seen before. They showed her mother laughing with her friends, receiving academic honors, riding horses, and playing with young cousins, who were now the adults, making her feel at home. "I need to show you something else," James said, opening a connecting door to an adjacent office. "This is where your mother did all of her computer programming." The office was filled with advanced technology that looked like it was from decades in the future. There were multiple computer screens, powerful processors, and other devices Sarah could not even begin to identify. Elizabeth created trading algorithms that are still producing income for the family's foundation, Margaret clarified. Her research in artificial intelligence was revolutionary. She was designing predictive financial models that were 20 years ahead of what the industry was doing. David chimed in. If she had lived, she would have completely transformed the world of computational finance. Sarah lowered herself into the chair at her mother's desk. She ran her fingers across the keys of a computer that was far more sophisticated than she ever dreamed her mother could have owned. Why didn't she ever tell me about any of this? Sarah wondered aloud. Perhaps she was going to, James offered softly. Maybe she believed she had more time. A quiet knock on the door broke the moment. Margaret's assistant stood there, looking troubled. I apologize for the interruption, but there has been a new development. Richard Mitchell just made an attempt to get into Sarah's main trust account. When the bank denied him access, he became very angry and started making threats to the bank employees. James's face grew stern. What sort of threats? He informed the teller that if the Wellington family believed they could take his wife and child, they would live to regret it. He claimed he had connections they were unaware of, and methods for getting what he felt belonged to him. Sarah felt her baby give an anxious kick, reacting to her own rising stress. He's not just going to stop, is he? She asked. No, James answered grimly. Men like Richard never just give up. When they feel cornered, they become more aggressive. Margaret walked over to the window, her face lost in thought. We must be ready for the chance that he will try something reckless. What do you mean by that? Sarah asked. David explained. What she means is that Richard Mitchell has already had 2 wives die under suspicious circumstances. He is now facing financial ruin and a criminal trial. Desperate men will do desperate things. As if their words had called to him, Sarah's phone began to ring. Richard's name flashed on the screen, and the entire room went silent. Do not answer that, James cautioned. Actually, I think I have to, Sarah replied, taking everyone by surprise. I need to hear what he has to say. She answered the phone and switched it to speaker so everyone else could listen. Sarah, darling, I have been worried sick about you. Richard's voice was slick and full of fake concern, the same tone he always used when he was trying to manipulate her. Where are you? I am somewhere I can be safe, Richard. Safe. Sarah, you are 7 months pregnant. You should be at home so I can look after you. The same way you looked after Margaret Thornton and Patricia Carlyle. An icy silence hung on the line for a few long seconds. When Richard finally spoke again, his voice was completely stripped of its false warmth. I see they have been filling your head with nonsense. Is it nonsense, Richard? Did Margaret Thornton really kill herself right after you emptied her trust fund? Did Patricia Carlyle just vanish after she attempted to leave you? Sarah, you are being manipulated by people who just want to use you for your inheritance. Don't you see that? The only one who has been using me for money is you. Everything I have ever done was to protect our family. By stealing $5 million from me, by forging my name on legal papers, by threatening to take my child away? Richard's facade finally crumbled away entirely. That baby is also mine, Sarah, and I will get what is mine, every last bit of it. The only thing you are going to get is a long prison sentence. We will just see about that. Richard's voice dropped to a low whisper that sent a wave of alarm through the room. Do you think your fancy, wealthy family can keep you safe? Do you really believe they can keep me away from my own child? You have no idea what I am truly capable of. The call ended abruptly. James was immediately on the phone with his security detail, while Margaret was contacting the family's lawyers. David positioned himself by the window, his eyes scanning the property, with the focus of a man expecting an attack. He is going to make a move tonight, David said with grim certainty. I can just feel it. Sarah rested her hands on her pregnant belly, feeling her daughter kick with a powerful urgency, as if she also could sense the approaching danger. What are we going to do? Sarah asked. We are going to protect you and the baby, James stated with conviction, no matter what it takes. As the sun went down over the Wellington estate, Sarah understood that her new life of privilege and family also brought with it dangers she had never imagined. But for the first time in 8 years, she would not be facing those dangers by herself. And that single choice changed everything. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the piercing shriek of the estate's security alarms shattered the silence. Sarah snapped awake in her mother's old bedroom, her hand flying protectively to her pregnant stomach as she tried to get her bearings. Through the large French doors that opened to the balcony, she saw the beams of flashlights cutting through the dark gardens. Her phone buzzed instantly. It was James. Sarah, lock your door and stay away from the windows. We have several intruders on the grounds. Is it Richard? Almost certainly. Our security team is moving in, but I need you to get into your mother's old safe room. Do you see the bookshelf on the left side of the piano? Sarah's eyes scanned the moonlit room. Find the volume of Shakespeare's sonnets. It is on the third shelf from the top, with a blue leather cover. Pull on it. Sarah located the book and gave it a tug. She gasped as an entire section of the bookshelf swung silently inward, revealing a hidden room. We had that put in during the Cold War, James explained over the phone as Sarah stepped inside the secret space. Your mother used to hide in there whenever she got into trouble. Inside, there was a phone, bottled water, and a direct line to the police. The safe room was bigger than Sarah imagined, furnished with comfortable chairs, emergency supplies, and a bank of monitors displaying feeds from the estate's security cameras. On the screens, she saw shadowy figures dressed in black moving stealthily toward the main house. I can see at least 6 men, Sarah told James on the secure line. Richard brought a team. Yes, but so did we. Sarah watched on the monitors as the estate's security personnel skillfully surrounded the intruders. What came next was a nerve-wracking standoff that dragged on for nearly an hour. Richard's men tried to find a way into the mansion, but the Wellington security team expertly contained them, avoiding a violent clash. At 3:15 in the morning, the main floodlights of the estate flashed on, bathing the grounds in brilliant light and leaving the intruders completely exposed. Sarah could now see Richard perfectly, standing near the front door, holding what looked like a gun. Richard Mitchell, James's voice boomed from a loudspeaker across the property. You are trespassing. Leave the grounds now, and we might not press charges. I want my wife, Richard yelled back. And I want my child. You can't keep them from me. Your wife is here because she wants to be, and she has asked you to leave her alone. She has been brainwashed. She has no idea what she is saying. Sarah took a deep breath and pressed the button that activated the safe room's external speaker. Her own voice boomed across the grounds, clear and strong. Richard, I know exactly what I am doing. I know all about the money you have been stealing. I know about Margaret and Patricia, I know who you really are. Sarah, Richard's voice suddenly broke with panic. You are making a huge mistake. These people are just trying to control you. They do not care about you. The only one who has been controlling me is you, Richard. I am your husband. I love you. You do not love me, Richard. You only love what you thought you could steal from me. The standoff continued for another 20 minutes, with Richard switching between begging and making threats as the security team held their ground. Sarah watched on the screens as police cars began to stream onto the property, their flashing red and blue lights painting the estate. Detective Rodriguez stepped out and raised a megaphone. Richard Mitchell, you are under arrest for trespassing, domestic violence, financial fraud, and conspiracy. Put down your weapon and step forward with your hands where I can see them. This is all a big misunderstanding, Richard screamed. They are holding my pregnant wife in there against her will. Sir, we have already spoken with your wife. She is here by her own choice and has requested police protection from you. What happened next sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Instead of giving up, Richard raised his weapon. He did not aim at the police, but at the mansion windows, right where he imagined Sarah was hiding. If I cannot have her, nobody can, he shrieked. The police moved instantly and with precision. In a matter of seconds, Richard was on the ground, his gun kicked far away and his hands secured behind his back with zip ties. His men surrendered immediately. After the police cruisers drove away with Richard and his crew, Sarah finally came out of the safe room. James, David, and Margaret were waiting for her in the hall. Is it really over? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. The immediate threat is gone, James confirmed. But Richard is likely facing federal charges for his financial crimes, on top of attempted assault for tonight. He will not see the outside of a prison for a very, very long time. Sarah collapsed into a nearby chair, the weight of the night suddenly hitting her. I cannot believe I was married to someone who could do this. People like him are masters of disguise, Margaret said softly. It is not your fault that you could not see the monster he was hiding. What do I do now? Sarah asked. Now, David said, with a warm smile, you focus on having a healthy baby, and we will focus on teaching you everything you need to know about being a Wellington. 3 months later, Sarah gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby girl in the estate's private medical wing. As she held little Elizabeth, named after her grandmother, Sarah could hardly believe how much her world had changed. She has your mother's eyes, James said gently, looking down at his new great-niece. And I bet she has her grandmother's stubborn side, too, Margaret added with a chuckle. Sarah looked around the room at the family she never knew she had. James, David, Margaret, and several other cousins had all come to meet the newest member of the Wellington family. For the very first time in her life, she felt completely safe and unconditionally loved. What do you say, Elizabeth? Sarah whispered to her baby. Are you ready to learn about your family's empire? Baby Elizabeth let out a tiny yawn and snuggled deeper into her mother's arms, as if to say she was ready for any adventure that was coming. And Sarah knew, with a certainty that filled her heart, that the two of them could face anything together. 6 weeks after Elizabeth was born, Sarah stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Wellington Foundation's headquarters in Manhattan, with her daughter sleeping soundly in her arms. The city spread out beneath them, a massive tribute to the ambition and drive that her family had helped build for 4 generations. Your great-grandfather bought this building in 1943, James explained, coming to stand beside Sarah at the window. Back then, everyone said he was crazy for investing so much in Manhattan real estate. What made him do it? Sarah asked, gently rocking Elizabeth as the baby stirred. He had vision, James said, gesturing toward the busy streets far below. He could see things that other people just could not. Today, Wellington Holdings owns 47 buildings in Manhattan alone, not to mention major properties in London, Tokyo, and Dubai. Margaret came over holding a tablet that displayed financial charts that would have made Sarah's head spin just a few months ago. But now, after weeks of intensive tutoring about her family's global business empire, she was finally starting to grasp the incredible scale of her inheritance. Your personal trust fund generates about $50 million a year in passive income, Margaret explained. But that is just a tiny piece of the puzzle. The family foundation itself controls assets valued at over $400 billion. $400 billion? Sarah echoed, the number still feeling unreal. Your mother's algorithms alone have earned over $60 billion in returns since she passed away, David added, walking into the office with a pile of proposals. We have been using that money to fund clean water projects in developing nations. We also have scholarship programs for underprivileged students, and we fund a lot of medical research. Sarah walked over to her mother's portrait, which had the place of honor in the foundation's main conference room. Elizabeth Wellington Mitchell smiled out from the canvas, her eyes just as warm as the ones baby Elizabeth now had. She would have completely changed the tech industry if she had lived, Sarah said quietly. Oh, she still did, James replied. Through her work, through you, and now through your daughter. A legacy is not just what we build in our own lifetime. It is about the possibilities we create for the generations that come after us. In the weeks that followed, Sarah threw herself into learning every single detail of the Wellington Empire. She pored over financial statements, sat in on board meetings, and met with the foundation's program directors to see firsthand how their incredible wealth was being used to make the world a better place. We are not just wealthy people who spend money, Margaret explained to her during one of their afternoon lessons. We are caretakers of resources that have the power to change the world. Every single investment we make, every charity we support, every business we partner with, has the potential to affect millions of lives. Sarah discovered that Wellington Holdings had been one of the first investors in renewable energy firms that were now leading the charge against climate change. They had funded educational programs that had helped over 200,000 students escape poverty and build professional careers. Their medical research grants had helped develop new treatments for cancer, Alzheimer's, and rare genetic diseases. This is what your mother wanted to be a part of, James told Sarah one evening, as they looked over proposals for new foundation projects. She always believed that wealth without a purpose was just meaningless. What about our daughter? Sarah asked. She glanced down at Elizabeth, who was happily chewing on a teething ring. What kind of life is she going to have with all of this around her? That really depends on how you decide to raise her, David said with a thoughtful look. Money can be a great blessing, but it can also be a terrible curse. It can give a person the freedom to make a real difference in the world, or it can completely shut them off from reality. How can I be sure it's a blessing for her? You can do that by teaching her that having privilege also comes with responsibility, Margaret added. You show her that the advantages she has are not just for her own good, but for the good of every person she has the power to help. Over the following months, Sarah started to find her own way in the family business. Her skills with mathematics, paired with everything she was learning about her mother's work, made her an especially key player in the Foundation's Technology Investment Division. You have your mother's gut feeling for seeing which innovations will be breakthroughs, James remarked one day, after Sarah had pinpointed a small startup that later grew into a billion-dollar company. It is almost as if you inherited her special formula for seeing the future. Exactly 1 year after learning about her true family history, Sarah was invited to give a speech at the Foundation's annual board meeting. As she stood in front of the room of directors who were titans of industry, Nobel Prize winners, and leaders of social change, she felt the immense weight of her family's legacy. She also felt her own duty to continue that legacy. A year ago, I believed I was just an ordinary person, Sarah started. I was a pregnant woman, married to a man who only saw me as a tool to get what he wanted. I had no clue that I was part of a family that was committed to using its resources to help other people rise. She gazed around the room at the faces that had grown so familiar over the last year. These were the people who had accepted her not just as an heiress, but as a true partner in their shared mission to make the world a better place. Today, I am here to propose something brand new: the Elizabeth Wellington Initiative for Women's Financial Independence. Sarah advanced to the first slide of her presentation. It displayed statistics about financial abuse in relationships that caused several board members to gasp audibly. Every single year, hundreds of thousands of women feel completely stuck in abusive situations because they do not have the financial means to get away safely. They remain with partners who harm them, steal from them, and control every aspect of their lives because they are convinced they have no other options. The room fell into a deep silence as Sarah spoke on. We are going to put an end to that. I am proposing that we set aside $100 million each year to offer free legal help, emergency housing, financial literacy courses, and startup funds for women who are escaping abusive partners. A board member, Dr. Patricia Chen, put up her hand. What gives you the confidence that we can succeed when so many other organizations have tried and failed? Because we possess something that those other groups do not have, Sarah shot back. We have the ability to offer thorough, long-term support. The majority of domestic violence programs can give someone a temporary place to stay and some basic counseling. We can provide all of that, plus job training, chances for education, legal advocates, and even seed money for their own small businesses. We can build a complete system that guides women from a moment of crisis to a life of independence and empowerment. Sarah went on, and after that, we can teach them how to help other women achieve the very same thing. The board's vote to approve the new initiative was unanimous. Just 6 months later, the Elizabeth Wellington Initiative had assisted more than 3,000 women in leaving abusive relationships and starting fresh. The program offered everything from immediate help in emergencies to long-term career support, and its success rate was higher than even Sarah's most hopeful predictions. Your mother would be so incredibly proud of you, James said to Sarah as they looked over the program's first annual report together. She always said that the single greatest privilege of having wealth was the power to open doors for other people. Sarah looked down at her baby, Elizabeth, who was now 1 year old. The little girl was already showing hints of her grandmother's sharp mind and strong will. As she watched her daughter stacking blocks, building them up, and knocking them down just to start over again, Sarah saw a future filled with endless possibilities. You know what I think, Elizabeth? Sarah whispered to her daughter. I think your great-grandmother would have been wonderful at this work, and I believe you are going to be even more amazing at it one day. Elizabeth glanced up at her mother and clapped her little hands as if to agree that she was ready for any challenge that came her way. Through the large windows of the foundation, the sun was beginning to set over Manhattan. It bathed the city in a warm, golden light. In that quiet moment, Sarah felt the spirit of all the Wellington women who had lived before her and all the women who would follow. Together, they were creating something important. It was something that would endure long after they were all gone. Something that was going to change the world. 2 years passed after Richard was arrested, and Sarah believed the worst was finally behind her. The Elizabeth Wellington Initiative was a huge success. Her daughter was a happy and healthy toddler, and she had discovered her purpose at the family foundation. But legal fights with controlling abusers are rarely simple, and Richard Mitchell was, if nothing else, incredibly persistent. Sarah, we have to talk. James's voice was heavy with concern as he walked into her office at the Foundation's Manhattan headquarters. Richard's legal team just filed an appeal. Sarah looked up from a financial summary she was reading, and her heart immediately started to pound in her chest. What sort of appeal? They are arguing that his conviction was based on evidence that was faked. They are demanding a completely new trial and are also requesting emergency custody of Elizabeth until a decision is made. Emergency custody? Sarah's voice shot up with such alarm that 2-year-old Elizabeth looked up from her coloring book, her small face filled with worry. But he is in prison. Not anymore. The look on James's face was darker than anything Sarah had ever witnessed. He was let out on bail while the appeal is pending. The judge decided he was not a flight risk due to his business connections in the area. Sarah felt that familiar, chilling fear she thought she had escaped for good. When did this happen? 3 days ago. 3 days? Why did no one tell me? We have been working non-stop to make our legal case stronger before we broke the news to you. Sarah, there is something else. Richard's lawyers are now claiming that your testimony was forced, and they are saying that the Wellington family used its influence to manipulate the original investigation. Margaret came into the office, followed by their main lawyer, Jonathan Blake, who had represented the family for more than 20 years. His face was serious, yet he looked sure of himself. Mrs. Mitchell, Jonathan began, I need you to understand that Richard's legal team is just desperate. The evidence we have against him is absolutely massive, and these new accusations are just a last-ditch effort to create some reasonable doubt. But what if it actually works? Sarah asked. What if they manage to persuade the jury that I was manipulated into testifying against him? That is not going to happen, Margaret said with absolute certainty. We have paperwork going back for years, financial statements that cannot be faked, and testimony from the families of his other victims. What about Elizabeth? Can he actually win custody of her? Jonathan shook his head. To get a temporary custody order, they have to prove that a child is in immediate danger, with the person who is currently caring for them. You are a model mother with more than enough resources to give Elizabeth everything she needs. A judge would never take her away from you because of these ridiculous claims. Even with their comforting words, Sarah lived in a state of pure anxiety for the entire next week. She hired more security for the estate, cut back on her public events, and caught herself checking and rechecking the locks on doors she had not bothered to lock for months. Elizabeth could feel her mother's fear and became very clingy. She did not want to play by herself and would wake up in the middle of the night crying from bad dreams. Mama scared? Elizabeth asked one morning. Her vocabulary was small, but her ability to sense emotions was already amazing. Mama is just being extra careful, sweetie, Sarah answered, scooping her daughter up onto her lap. But we are very safe. We have so many people who love us and are here to protect us. The phone call arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of a foundation board meeting Sarah was attending. Margaret picked up her cell phone, listened for a second, and her face turned ghostly white. That was the courthouse security office, Margaret said to the entire room. Richard Mitchell just submitted an emergency motion demanding immediate custody of Elizabeth. He is claiming that Sarah is mentally unstable because she came into so much money so quickly, and that the child is being brought up in a home that is harmful to her well-being. Sarah's hands started to tremble. Is he allowed to do that? He is allowed to file any motion he wants, Jonathan said, already packing up his briefcase. But getting a judge to approve it is another story altogether. We have to leave for the courthouse right now. The emergency hearing took place that very same afternoon. Sarah sat inside the courtroom, holding Elizabeth close. The little girl had refused to come without her favorite stuffed elephant, thinking this was just another one of the boring meetings grown-ups went to. Richard's attorney was a woman with sharp features named Victoria Steinberg. She laid out their case with a kind of aggressive polish that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Your Honor, my client argues that Sarah Mitchell has become mentally unwell ever since she learned about her inheritance. She has gone from living a simple, middle-class life to having a delusion that she is entitled to billions of dollars. This fantasy has caused her to make up false stories about a successful businessman who has only ever been a loving husband and father. Objection, Jonathan Blake said as he stood up. Mrs. Mitchell's inheritance is fully documented and has been confirmed. She is not suffering from a delusion. She is, in fact, one of the wealthiest women in America. Judge Harrison, a practical woman in her 60s, gave a doubtful look. Miss Steinberg, are you truly suggesting that becoming an heiress is some form of mental breakdown? Your Honor, I am suggesting that this abrupt shift in her life, along with the influence of relatives with a clear financial stake, has impaired Mrs. Mitchell's judgment and her fitness to act in her child's best interests. Sarah could feel her anger rising. Richard was using the exact same manipulative games from their marriage, but this time in a courtroom to take her daughter away. Furthermore, Steinberg added, Mr. Mitchell has cause to believe his wife is being cut off from her friends and any outside viewpoints, surrounded only by individuals who stand to gain by keeping her dependent on the Wellington family wealth. Your Honor, Jonathan Blake countered, if we are going to discuss isolation and dependency, then we should look at Mr. Mitchell's own conduct throughout the marriage. He methodically severed Mrs. Mitchell's ties to her friends, dictated her access to funds, and made her think she was entirely reliant on him, all while he was secretly siphoning millions from her trust fund. Judge Harrison then looked at Sarah. Mrs. Mitchell, I would like to hear your side of this directly. What is your response to these claims about your mental condition and your capabilities as a mother? Sarah rose to her feet with Elizabeth on her hip and looked at the judge who held their future in her hands. Your Honor, 2 years ago, my entire life was a lie. I was in a marriage with a man who made me believe I was worthless, weak, and utterly dependent on him. Then I found out that I have a family that loves me, the means to secure my daughter's future, and a way to help other women get away from the very same abuse that I suffered. She stared straight at Richard, who sat at the defendant's table, wearing a mask of phony concern that she could now easily see was pure, calculated manipulation. If that is your definition of mentally unstable, then I will wear the label of crazy for the rest of my days, because the only other option is to return to being that terrified, lonely woman who allows another person to decide her value. Judge Harrison observed Sarah for a long moment. Mrs. Mitchell, could you describe your current home life and the support system you have? I reside at the Wellington family home with my Uncle James, my cousins David and Margaret, and a dedicated staff that assists with Elizabeth's care while I am working. She has her own pediatrician, an education specialist, and more caring relatives than any little girl could ever dream of. And what about your work with the foundation? I manage a program that has assisted more than 10,000 women in leaving abusive situations and putting their lives back together. This work provides my life with purpose and gives Elizabeth a legacy that she can be proud of one day. At that exact moment, Elizabeth declared for all to hear, "Mama, help people." A gentle wave of laughter spread through the courtroom, and even Judge Harrison cracked a smile. Ms. Steinberg, the judge said, directing her attention back to Richard's attorney, what proof can you offer that Mr. Mitchell would create a superior environment for this child compared to what Mrs. Mitchell just outlined, Your Honor. Mr. Mitchell is a successful chief executive officer with a stable income and a steady income that came from looting his wife's trust fund. Alleged looting, Your Honor. Those charges are still in the appeals process. The bank statements are not under appeal, Ms. Steinberg. The documentation is perfectly clear that Mr. Mitchell transferred millions of dollars from accounts owned by his wife without her awareness or permission. Judge Harrison reviewed her notes for several minutes as the courtroom sat in a tense stillness. Elizabeth played contentedly with a stuffed elephant, chattering quietly to herself about Mama's work and Uncle James. At last, the judge broke the silence. The motion for emergency custody is denied, Mr. Mitchell. The information presented here indicates that you are not pursuing custody for the good of your daughter, but rather as a tactic to keep control over your former wife and her finances. Richard started to get up from his seat. Your Honor, that is not true. Sit down, Mr. Mitchell. In addition, I am issuing an order that you are to stay at least 500 feet away from Mrs. Mitchell and the child at all times. Any breach of this order will lead to your immediate arrest and imprisonment. As they walked out of the courthouse, Sarah felt a burden she did not even know she was carrying finally lift from her shoulders. Richard's last-ditch legal schemes had crumbled, and she was at long last genuinely free. Mama happy? Elizabeth inquired as they headed toward their car. Yes, my love. Mama is very happy. Later that evening, Sarah sat in the room that once belonged to her mother at the estate, cradling Elizabeth as she drifted into sleep. Out the windows, she could see the glowing lights of the Foundation's research center, where teams of scientists were developing projects that would better the lives of millions. She thought back to the frightened pregnant woman who had been knocked over in a bank lobby 3 years prior, and she smiled. That woman had found her people. That woman had discovered her own power. That woman had made a difference in the world, and she was only just getting started. 5 years after the court victory that guaranteed Elizabeth's safety, Sarah was once again standing before the Wellington Foundation's board of directors. This time, however, she was not just proposing a new project. She was being confirmed as the Foundation's youngest ever chairwoman. Ladies and gentlemen, James declared to the full boardroom, it is my honor to introduce our new chair, Sarah Wellington Mitchell. The room erupted in thunderous applause. Elizabeth, who was now 7 years old and seated in the front row next to her Uncle James, clapped with all her might and shouted, "That is my mama!" More laughter filled the space, the kind of deep, heartfelt joy that made Sarah's heart expand with thankfulness for the family she had discovered and the life she had created. "Thank you," Sarah began, her voice steady and self-assured in a way that would have astounded the scared young woman she used to be. 5 years ago, I was certain I knew who I was. I was mistaken about nearly everything. She advanced to her first presentation slide, which displayed a photo of the original Elizabeth Wellington Initiative office. A small room with 2 desks and a single telephone. Today, the Elizabeth Wellington Initiative is active in 47 states and 12 countries. We have supported over 50,000 women in breaking free from abusive partners and starting new lives. But that is only a glimpse of what we can achieve when we work together. Sarah scanned the room, looking at the faces of those who had become her family. The board members who had accepted her not just as an heiress, but as a collaborator in their shared mission to heal the world. I want to share with you my vision for the next chapter of our work, the Elizabeth Wellington Global Education Initiative. She moved to the following slide, which presented statistics on women's education across the globe that caused several board members to lean in intrigued. As of right now, more than 130 million girls across the planet are refused an education for no other reason than their gender. They are prevented from attending school because of poverty, cultural traditions, and families that fail to recognize the worth of educating their daughters. Elizabeth Wellington, from her seat in the front row, put up her small hand. "Mama, can I ask something?" Sarah smiled, delighted by her daughter's inquisitive nature. "Of course, my dear. Why do some people not want girls to learn?" "That is the most important question of all, Elizabeth. And it is the very reason we have to make a change." Sarah turned her attention back to the board. "We possess the resources needed to establish thorough educational programs that do more than just get girls into classrooms. We can tackle the fundamental problems that keep them away, like offering poverty assistance to their families, teaching communities about the importance of educating girls, and creating financial opportunities for women that prove the power of knowledge." A board member, Dr. Patricia Chen, nodded with a look of approval. "What scale are we discussing for this project?" $5 billion over 10 years, which would be enough to provide complete educational programs for more than 2 million girls around the world. A murmur of excitement went through the room. This was a massive undertaking, even for the Wellington Foundation. "But this is what sets our plan apart from other education projects," Sarah went on. "Each girl that we educate will in turn become a champion for the next generation. We are not simply building schools. We are forging a worldwide network of educated women who will stand up for their own daughters, for their communities, and for their nations." Margaret Wellington raised a hand. "Sarah, this is precisely the kind of revolutionary vision your mother would have championed in her work. How will we track our success?" "We will measure it in generations," Sarah answered. "When a girl attends school, her own future children are 6 times more likely to get an education. When women are given economic power, the rates of domestic violence fall sharply. When mothers are educated, the rates of infant death drop to historic lows. We will not just be transforming single lives, we will be altering the course of entire societies." The board passed the initiative with a unanimous vote. When the meeting was over, Sarah strolled through the foundation's corridors with Elizabeth, who was determined to stop and inspect every single photograph and award displayed on the walls. "Mommy, is great-grandma Elizabeth in these pictures?" Elizabeth asked, pointing to a wall of old family photographs. "Some of them are, sweetie," Sarah said, kneeling down to her daughter's eye level. "Do you want to see my very favorite one?" They walked over to a portrait that held a special place in the main hallway. It showed Elizabeth Wellington Mitchell at her college graduation, her smile absolutely glowing with hope and potential. "She looks just like you, Mommy. People say you look like her too." "Will I get to help people, just like you and great-grandma Elizabeth?" Sarah gathered her daughter into a warm hug, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, and just soaking in the incredible joy this little girl brought into her life. "Only, if that is what you want, sweetheart, you can be absolutely anything you want to be. I want to help people, just like you do. Then that is exactly what you will do, but you have to learn everything you possibly can first. You must always be curious about the world, and you have to be kind to every single person you meet. Can you do that for me?" "Yes, Mommy." On their way to the exit, they passed by the Foundation's research labs, where entire teams of scientists were busy working on projects that would one day improve millions of lives. They went by the Education Center, where students on scholarships were studying for careers that would lift their families out of poverty. They also passed the Crisis Intervention Center, where skilled counselors were helping women find a way out of dangerous situations and start over with new, safe lives. "All of this is possible because of your great-grandmother," Sarah explained to Elizabeth as the elevator took them down to the parking garage. "She truly believed that having wealth without a real purpose was completely meaningless. She believed that with great privilege came great responsibility. What is responsibility, Mommy? It means that when you have the power to help others, you should use it. Not because someone tells you to, but because it is the right thing to do. That night, Sarah tucked Elizabeth into bed. It was the very same room her own mother had slept in as a little girl. The space had been updated with bright, cheerful colors and furniture made for a child, but the feeling of the room was still the same. It was a place where a brilliant woman had once dreamed of changing the world. Mommy, can you tell me the story about the scared lady at the bank? Elizabeth asked, just as she did almost every single night. It had turned into their special bedtime ritual, the story of how Sarah had found her true family and discovered her own strength. Elizabeth never once got tired of hearing about the day her mommy stopped feeling scared and started being brave. Once upon a time, Sarah started, getting comfortable in the rocking chair next to Elizabeth's bed, there was a woman who believed she was not special at all. She was married to a man who constantly told her she was powerless and that she was worthless. And for a long time, she actually believed him. But she was not powerless. Elizabeth jumped in, right on cue, just like she always did. No, she certainly was not. She just had not realized it yet. One day, this woman went to a bank to ask a few questions about her money, and her husband became incredibly angry. He pushed her. He really did. But a very kind man who worked at the bank saw exactly what happened, and he noticed something about the woman. He realized that she was part of a family that had been searching for her for a very, very long time. A family with a lot of money, a family with a lot of love, Sarah corrected her gently. The money was only a tool that they used to help other people. The family itself was the real treasure. And then what happened? Then the woman learned that she was not powerless at all. She learned that she came from a long line of incredibly strong women. They had always used their resources to make the world a much better place. She learned that she could help other women who felt scared, just like she once had. And she had a beautiful baby girl. She did. And that baby girl grew up always knowing that she was loved, that she was strong, and that she could accomplish anything she put her mind to. Elizabeth let out a big yawn and snuggled down deeper under her blankets. Mommy, when I grow up, I want to help scared ladies too. I am sure you will, sweetheart. I think you are going to help so many people. As Elizabeth slowly drifted off to sleep, Sarah remained in the rocking chair for a little while longer, looking around the room where her own mother had once dreamed about the future. On the nightstand was a photo of 4 generations of Wellington women: her great-grandmother, her grandmother, her mother, herself, and little Elizabeth. They were strong women who had built something that would last. They were women who had used their own advantages to create new opportunities for others. They were women who understood that real wealth is not measured by dollars, but by the number of lives you can touch and the positive changes you can help make happen. Through the window, the huge estate grounds disappeared into the darkness, but Sarah could see the bright lights of the foundation's buildings far in the distance. Tomorrow, those buildings would once again be filled with people all working to solve problems, find new solutions, and create opportunities. Teachers would be training to work in classrooms in remote villages. Researchers would be developing new ways to provide clean water. Counselors would be getting ready to help women escape dangerous homes. All of it was funded by a family that understood the true weight of privilege and the deep joy of having a purpose. Sarah thought about Richard, who was now serving a 15-year sentence for financial fraud and domestic violence. She hardly ever thought about him anymore, except to feel a sense of gratitude that his cruel, narcissistic abuse was what ultimately led her to find her real family and her true purpose in life. She thought about that scared, pregnant woman who had been pushed to the floor in a bank lobby 7 years ago, and she smiled. That woman had found her family. That woman had found her strength. That woman had gone on to change the world. Getting up from the rocking chair, Sarah leaned over and kissed her sleeping daughter's forehead, whispering, "Sweet dreams, Elizabeth. Tomorrow we will continue to change the world." As she switched off the lights and quietly closed the door, Sarah felt the comforting presence of all the Wellington women who came before her, and the incredible promise of those who would come after. They were building something together, something that would endure long after they were all gone, something that would improve the world one life at a time for many generations to come. Outside, the stars shone brightly over the Wellington estate, like silent witnesses to a legacy of love, strength, and service that would go on as long as there were people who needed help and brave women ready to give it. The Elizabeth Wellington Initiative had started with one frightened woman's dream to help others and had grown into a global organization for positive change. And this was just the very beginning. In corporate boardrooms and in classrooms all across the globe, women were finding their own strength, discovering their own worth, and realizing their own power to change not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others. The scared woman from the bank had become the leader of an entire movement. The powerless victim had become a powerful agent for change. The isolated wife had become the head of a family committed to lifting other people up. And in a little bedroom in the Hudson Valley, a 7-year-old girl was sleeping soundly, dreaming of the day she would take the torch and carry it forward. She would continue building the kind of world her great-grandmother had imagined. A world where every single woman understood her value, claimed her own power, and used her strength to help others do the exact same thing. The foundation they built together would stand the test of time. The lives they had changed would create ripple effects, touching millions more people. And the legacy of love, courage, and purpose would carry on as long as there were people who believed that wealth without compassion is meaningless, but wealth combined with love could change absolutely everything. This was the Wellington way. This was the power of women supporting other women. This is what can happen when someone finally understands that their greatest strength is not in what they can get for themselves, but in what they can give to others. And it all began with a single push, one moment of cruelty that brought a powerful truth out into the light. Sometimes, the very worst thing that ever happens to you is what sets you on the path to do the best thing you will ever do. Sarah Elizabeth Wellington Mitchell had found her family. She had claimed her inheritance, and she had built a legacy that would outlive them all. But the most important thing she did was learn how to help other people find their own strength, their own worth, and their own power to change the world. And that was a treasure more valuable than all the money on earth. And that, my friend, is the power of discovering your true worth. Sarah's story teaches us 3 profound lessons. First, the people who try to make you feel small are often the ones who fear your greatness. Second, your past does not define your future, but it can fuel it. And third, the greatest wealth is not money. It's the ability to lift others up while you rise. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own strength, or if you know someone who needs to hear this message, please share it with them. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that could change your perspective. Leave a comment below telling me, what would you do if you discovered your entire life was built on a lie? This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful lessons and inspiration. Every story we share is crafted with intention to entertain, to educate, and to empower. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.